Before I let Vika introduce our audit a little bit and Joel introduce the speakers, I'll just say a few words about the context in which we've been doing this work. In the last decade, we've seen a dramatic withdrawal of central government funding to local authorities, which is resulting in drastic austerity measures, forcing cuts of youth venues, libraries, community centres, contributing to the rise of homelessness and poverty and even the epidemic of violence that we are seeing on the streets of London today. During the last year that we've been doing this work, we've spoken to a lot of Newham residents who are feeling these cuts in their everyday life and incredible voluntary organisations who are trying to plug the gap where they can. But of course, the resources for them are also limited. However, this complete overhaul in the way that local government is financed is only the latest chapter in an ongoing story, and austerity is more than just cuts to services. It's also a shift in power relations, where with declining public spending, also public scrutiny and accountability is being eroded, and decisions are increasingly being made as purely administrative actions, where the public has very little say. And the rationale there is always an economic one, not a rationale of social necessity. And that's why we've zoomed in on debt and LOBO loan debt. I'm not gonna go into the details of LOBO loans because there are people on the panel who are much more qualified to speak about them than I am. But maybe just to say that Newham, the London Borough of Newham is the most indebted local authority in the entire UK. And that's partly why we are here tonight and why we are focusing on Newham as this example of what is being done in the name of discipline imposed by debt and financialisation. I'm going to next let Vika speak a little bit about what has already been done, because obviously tonight is far from the first steps in this story. Quite the contrary, it's almost not the closing, but definitely, the end of one chapter in a story, in a very significant story. So I'll let Vika speak next. Thank you.
What I'm going to do is run you through, explain a bit how the report can be read, and then explain what basically has been done up to now. The slides might be a bit text heavy, but don't worry, you don't need to read through them. Like Fanny, I won't go into detail of what LOBO loans are. There's all the information on the report, and probably some of our speakers will explain it more. But I'll just mention that at least 240 councils have LOBO loans, which are very expensive and risky loans that have been sold by banks to councils. And as you can see, Newham is the one that has the most bank debt. The report is divided in various parts, and so we have a first part which is an introduction, and we explain first what we mean by illegitimate debt, and I'll go a bit more into detail as we go on of what is meant by illegitimate debt. We give an overview of how local government finance works, but we also look at what is happening at the moment in local government finance. So, for example, the cuts, the extreme cuts that we're facing. We then focus on analysing asking the question, are LOBO loans illegitimate? Now, as you'll probably hear from our speakers, you'll see that there are a lot of aspects of these loans that are very worrying. And so I'm just showing this slide to explain like the methodology that we use to look at these loans. And so we look at their illegitimacy based on the terms of the contracts, so simply the contracts, what is in the contracts that makes them problematic. What was the role of central government in making the selling of these loans happen in such an extensive way? We look at the role of the banks and the intermediaries, and we look at the role of the council. And so because obviously, people at the beginning, the first thing they think of is like, oh, the council, what did they do? But there's so many actors in this story that it's really important to understand why this happened and who was responsible for it. And then another element that's very important for us is the servicing of the debt. So what does it mean to be paying all this interest today on this debt in a moment in which we're facing extreme austerity measures? I'll come back to the question of the interest rates. But this is the list of our findings that, again, you can find in the report, in the executive summary. So first of all, we find that LOBO loan contracts infringe the law and contain grossly unfair clauses. The councils were encouraged to take out these loans by central government, and that they're definitely the result of an excessive power imbalance between the too big to fail banks and the public institutions. But there are also other actors. We find the brokers and the treasury management advisors, who are basically independent advisors who are meant to be advising the council, who actually have their advice is very conflicted, as they're receiving money both from the banks, from the brokers and from the council. We go very much in detail in this in the report. There also, every council has to analyze its internal processes and what went wrong within the council that allowed this to happen. But also look at how the money that was taken, was received through the LOBO loans, what was it used for? And was it used for legitimate causes that were actually benefiting the population or not? And finally, servicing LOBO loan debt in the context of austerity is exasperating human rights violations. Now, this is just an example I've just extracted apart from the report to just highlight a bit more what we mean by illegitimate debt. Because illegitimate debt is much broader than talking about illegal debt. There are some things that by law are wrong, but there are other things that it's about us sort of questioning, is this fair? Is this right? So these are the report is structured around some questions that the council or residents of a borough can go through. So the first one you can see is not necessarily a legal argument. Are the council's loans the result of excessive power imbalance between too big to fail banks and the councils? While the second one that I highlight is actually related to legal cases related to the rigging of LIBOR. So you'll see in the report different types of questions that are much broader than simply the legality of the loans. In the second part, we then focus on Newham. So we provide an introduction, an introduction of Newham. We look at Newham's LOBO debt, and then we use the questions that we provide in the first part of the report to analyze specifically Newham's loans. And then we have a whole chapter on the impact of the payment of the interest rates on the population in the current conditions of austerity. And just to give you, I mean, probably a lot of you are from Newham and know these statistics, but the borough has 1 in 25 residents are homeless. So if you look at the questions that we ask in chapter 9, we really look at the right to housing, the right to health, the right of children, the right to social security, right to democracy. The housing situation in Newham is very extreme, as we will also hear from Hannah. 43% of Newham's children grow up in poverty. So you can see, this is an old slide, so the data isn't up to date, but you can see how problematic it can become that if you're spending so much money on interest rates rather than spending them on local services. We then conclude describing what has been done up to now as part of the audit. Then we provide some conclusions and recommendations. Here's a summary of the conclusions and recommendations. I would just go through them quickly, but then in the report we provide some really practical, detailed recommendations, both for central government and for Newham, that can be taken now in the next few years. And mainly we focus on what can be done now about LOBO loans, what can be avoided what can be done to avoid the accumulation in the future, and what can be done to improve the effective scrutiny of local government finance. So what we think should be done now is that we should suspend interest payments on LOBO loans until their legitimacy is clarified. LOBO loan contracts that are deemed illegitimate should be cancelled and interest paid up to no returned. Termination of all budget cuts and the introduction of radical policy alternatives, because in doing this work we really exposed a lot of the issues with the accountability structures in local government. Now very quickly, these are just a few images to explain what has happened up to now. So the first part of the work was investigative, and we used a lot of freedom information request to find the actual contracts and details of the loans and so on. You can find all this in the report. We undertook a lot of interviews, both with residents, councillors and civil society, and this was specifically for the part on the impact of austerity on the population. And so we have a specific report on this that you can find there, Cuts and Contempt, and that we focused, it doesn't really talk much about LOBO loans, but it's really to try to give a voice to residents regarding the local issues. We then supported around 50 residents across the country in filing objections to LOBO loans. So you have the right as a resident to object to financial decisions of your council. And we have 2 objectors here who will tell us about their experience. And you can also find a manual on the table with more information on how you can use it. We also tried to involve councillors, the local community and broader networks in all the things we did. And also, I would like to emphasize that we've always done this with the idea that no one has to be part of the campaign to take action on this. We are providing the material for people to take action, but then we invite people from all the political spectrum, all the positions in society to take action based on their expertise, their motivation, and everyone here on the panel is talking on their own behalf. They haven't even read the report, so they can't associate to it. And we thank them very much for their individual action that they've taken up to now. We've used shareholder activism, which means turning up at banks' AGMs and asking questions to the bankers and sometimes obtaining a few results. And what impact have we had up to now? In 2015, there was a parliamentary inquiry on LOBO loans. Unfortunately, the inquiry stopped immediately afterwards. We do not know why. There was no justification, even if there's clear evidence that there's something wrong going on. Very interestingly, this year in July, 15 councils announced that they were going to challenge Barclays over the loans in court. And we're really hoping to see more. And we're also really hoping to see more challenging RBS because they also missold some very, very ugly loans. CIPFA is a body that advises on finance for councils, and they have also spoken out more or less openly about LOBO loans, and they have been forced to provide extra guidance on how LOBO loans have to be accounted for in the financial accounts. And finally, the media coverage, we also have a journalist here tonight who has also written about LOBO loans. That has been really important to get the information out. And there was a very important for us, a documentary in 2015 by Channel 4 Dispatches, specifically on LOBO loans, and that actually generated the parliamentary inquiry.
Like I said, my name is Abhishek Sachdev. I've got a couple of different hats I'm sort of wearing today. The first one, probably the most important one, is as a founder of a company called Vedanta Hedging. Very simply, we're an independent treasury consultancy firm. We set up in 2011 just to make sure that companies, when they're entering into hedging contracts or derivatives, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a second, they have someone that they can go to for independent advice. Believe it or not, for corporates, there are hundreds and thousands of lawyers, accountants, etc., but there is effectively no one you can go to for hedging advice. So our firm is very small. There's less than 10 of us, but we're the largest FCA-regulated company in the country doing what we're doing for small and medium-sized businesses, which is incredible, but it's true that it's such a niche area. But the reason why I want to talk about that area is because derivatives, there is a clear parallel link between derivatives and how they've been missold to corporates and small and medium-sized enterprises and what we're seeing here at Newham and other local authorities across the country. And part of me is in a bit of a conflict around this, not in the kind of conflict that we're having a go at these treasury advisors for, but a conflict in the sense that on the one hand, parts of what we're talking about here tonight are truly depressing. The numbers are horrific, and therefore I know that central government can do nothing about this because the numbers are so big. But at the same time, I know the power of what individuals can do alongside with the press and campaigners like many of us in this room today. So I just want to draw that parallel, because in 2011, I was speaking to a journalist who I went to school with. He was a technology journalist at the Telegraph. He then worked for a chap called Harry Wilson, who was at the Telegraph. Harry Wilson really jumped on this idea of small and medium-sized businesses being mis-sold derivatives. He then started a campaign in the Telegraph about this. 3 months later, the FCA, the regulator at that time, contacted me saying, can you come and advise us on this? That then led, and we actually got paid by the FCA. That then led to setting up of a redress scheme called the IRHP review, which led to 28,000 or so businesses getting approximately £4 billion of compensation. Now that was just set up by a little old unassuming person like myself. And yet, you know, the power of individuals plus media plus campaigners can really achieve great things. And we've done so much so far already as well. And the parallels are interesting because when the basis of a lot of the mis-selling around these corporates is simply they didn't understand the products that were given to them. Now, this isn't just as simple as caveat emptor or buyer beware, where we normally govern by English contract law, where you simply say, well, you signed that, you entered into it, tough luck. These are regulated derivative products, and therefore there are certain rules and regulations around how they should be sold, just like life insurance or normal insurance. And that was the basis on which a lot of companies have been compensated on. But at the same time, that was only open to very small businesses, deliberately so by the government. So a lot of larger businesses have been forced to litigate. And for the last almost 7 years, we've worked with a variety of very large corporates and businesses to litigate against banks for both derivative mis-selling and also LIBOR fraud. And you know, there's at least a law firm in the room who I know who's helped us in doing that as well. And I guess the key parallel to draw away from that is they themselves had a very similar issue, in a sense that they just did not understand what was being presented to them. Now, they may well be qualified accountants. They may well have some level of sophistication. They may well own hundreds of millions of pounds of debt, be large hoteliers, but that doesn't mean they understood the nuances of these derivatives. And so far, I mean, we've assisted in approximately 730 odd sort of different disputes. And so far, touch wood, with both hands, every single one of our cases has settled before going to court. And these cases are still ongoing and live. Just a few weeks ago, one of our clients filed a case of approximately £400 million of claim value against one of the major UK clearing banks. So these things are still going on. Now, let's talk a little bit about these LOBO products. I don't want to go into too much detail about this. A, it's covered in the report, and B, it's a Tuesday evening. You know, perhaps it'd be more appropriate to discuss the horror of these products tomorrow. But you know, these products are effectively embedded derivatives within loans. Now, I use the word embedded because this is an important qualification that regulator and indeed Her Majesty's Treasury as well as the government are effectively burying their heads in the sand, and they've kind of got a get out of jail free card for being able to do that, because they simply say these are just commercial loans, right? And a commercial loan is something we don't regulate. We don't have any powers over this. Now, they may have derivatives or options embedded within them. They may look like derivatives, they might smell like them, they might feel like them, they might cost the horrendous breakage cost like derivatives, but because they don't use the word derivative at the top of the contract, because of the Hammersmith and Fulham case, for example, that councils are not allowed to enter into derivative contracts. Effectively, the regulators and the government have sort of put their hands up saying, nothing to do with us, move on. Okay? But effectively, all the banks did was take these complex, long-term derivative products and simply wrap them into a loan. Okay? And that's effectively what a LOBO is. One of the key features of a LOBO in terms of how complex it is relates to some of the options and the interest rate call options embedded within the loan. And part of that feature is almost like a heads I win, tails you lose feature for the council, which means that if interest rates rise and these products are likely to provide benefit, right, protection, then actually the bank's likely to cancel them. If rates are low, and of course you'd want the bank to cancel it, they won't cancel it. So whatever happens, it's a lose-lose situation for the council. It's like giving someone an umbrella, making them walk around with it, but as soon as it starts to rain, you take away the umbrella. Whatever happens, that person loses. Okay, and these are incredibly complex. I mean, it took, we've spent, myself and a chap, Nick Dunbar, we've spent, a good 50, 60 hours pricing some of these derivatives, which was then used in the Channel 4 dispatches program, which was mentioned a little bit earlier. Now, again, one interesting aspect of these LOBO loans is a lot of the defense that's made by councils in terms of entering into these is they were being provided to us with low, attractive teaser rates. And one of the reasons for that is because the banks, the brokers, and some of the advisors were deliberately targeting and structuring these loans in a way that made them look very, very attractive, or almost irresistibly attractive. Because if, for example, LIBOR is at, say, 6%, and the bank comes up to you and says, hey, look, do you want to borrow at 3%? Okay, why would you not want to do that? And if the bank simply says, yeah, it's going to last 70 years, and we may cancel it early, that's the only kind of downside, really, and doesn't give them any more downside, why wouldn't the council want to enter into these and do as many as they possibly could? But they simply weren't told about the downsides. And one of the things that I think I said to the Parliamentary Committee, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, in 2015, just after the dispatches programme, was that we have the privilege of advising some of the largest property companies in the country, and none of those guys would even enter into products as complex as this. And yet we've got councillors and finance officers who've entered into these products. So and what's absurd about some of these products is the high rates of interest that get charged as soon as interest rates begin to fall. So there are some LOBOs which, for example, mean that the council is paying rates of above 10%. Now, again, as individuals, we can go into a bank branch and borrow at 1%, 2%, 2.5%. Why on earth should a council, which is technically as creditworthy as the sovereign, be having to pay interest rates 4 or 5 times that amount? Money which could, of course, be spent in services, which, of course, the report covers. Now, again, there's no need to go into the technicalities of this, for the purposes of tonight, but it's not. Please don't think for a second that the banks, can simply cancel these at no cost. If there is a several hundred million pound cost for, say, Newham to cancel their LOBOs with, say, Barclays today, Barclays would pretty much genuinely lose that amount of money. So it's not so easy for them to be able to write off, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, but it's not so simple as them doing that. Yes, banks made a huge, excessive amounts of profits in selling these. Myself and Nick Dunbar worked out that approximately around £65 million was made up front. And when I say up front, I mean pretty much on the day that these things are actually transacted through by Barclays in selling these loans to Newham. And even though these are, sometimes 60, 70-year terms, that's the amount of profit they make on day one, which is, the number speaks for itself. I guess the other aspect I want to talk about now, just very briefly, is the LIBOR manipulation side. So, yes, we spent 3 years, along with Councillor Fiaz and Councillor John Gray, Councillor John Whitworth, and others trying to campaign for councils to do something about this. Now, frankly, I didn't have time to go around to any council in the country apart from Newham to try to, agitate for this. In fact, we went to an audit meeting once a couple of years ago, I remember, to try to, agitate for something to be done. And John will probably talk about how difficult it's been. But what's interesting is earlier this year there was a LIBOR manipulation important case called the Property Alliance Group versus RBS, and it was an appeal case. And again, I won't go into the legalities of it, certainly not in front of an esteemed solicitor here, but effectively it made an interesting ruling that where there are regulatory findings of misconduct and LIBOR fraud against a specific bank, then it effectively can be implied that if you're entering into a contract with that bank, such as these LOBO loans, which were based on LIBOR, and if one took the view that actually, had I known that the bank was fraudulently manipulating LIBOR for its own benefit, I, as a decent, honest person or counsel or taxpayer, however you want to look at it, simply wouldn't have entered into any kind of facility with you at all. Not whether it's a LOBO or a loan or this kind of facility or another kind of facility. It's a very, in one sense, a very clean, straightforward argument, which doesn't involve having to argue mis-selling, what did the advisor say, who knew what, who was getting paid what, etc., etc. It's a pure, clean LIBOR manipulation claim. And that is the reason, after nearly 3 years of trying to campaign for this, as soon as this happened, I came to see Roxana and colleagues, and we quickly issued proceedings before 29th of June 2018, because that was the sort of 6-year cutoff point for when Barclays was first became publicly aware that they'd been manipulating LIBOR, and there's a 6-year sort of legal limitation date. 14 other councils have also protected their claim, principally against Barclays. And of course, we're hoping that more will do so now against RBS and perhaps some against Lloyds as well. Some of the other banks who were involved in this either don't exist anymore or weren't directly LIBOR setting banks, but there's some more work that needs to be done around that. And I guess, look, just a final point on that is no LIBOR manipulation case has ever actually reached court where there has been regulatory findings made against that bank, and there are regulatory findings against Lloyds and Barclays. So all the cases so far have settled. Of course, they're all confidential settlements, so neither I or anybody else will be able to say what's happening in these cases. But if you're making a claim for several £100 million against a bank, you're not just going to be settling for a few £1 million. You know, you can take it as read. It's going to be some sort of interesting number. But it doesn't come quickly, it doesn't come cheaply, and it will take a number of months to get there, sometimes even years to get to the right kind of outcome, and it will take significant legal expenditure in order to do that. And Newham are effectively just at the starting stage of that, but at least it's the important first step. So councils that have LOBO loans have got absolutely no choice, in my view, in order to be able to investigate this thoroughly, work with people like people in this room who are interested campaigners, residents who are being affected by this, in order to do something about it. Okay, thank you.
Focus E15 campaign was formed in 2013 when young mothers and pregnant women from the Focus E15 hostel in Stratford said no to social cleansing. They weren't going to be sent out of town, away from their families, their support networks, their schools, their nurseries, their community. The women from the hostel met with others, local residents, campaigners, the Revolutionary Communist Group, anarchists, feminists, and together the campaign was born. 5 years on, we continue to be on the streets of Stratford every Saturday on our stall, and that relentlessness has meant that we've met hundreds and hundreds of people in dire housing need who have come and participated in that campaign and built that campaign. And we work with anyone who wants to challenge the housing situation, and we try to understand the root cause of what has led to what is going on, not only in this borough, but London-wide, countrywide. Early on in the campaign, we met residents and former residents from the Carpenter's estate. It's in the shadow of the Olympic Stadium, and the irony wasn't lost. Hundreds of homes were empty, many of them for over a decade, whilst the most vulnerable and poorest members of the community were being sent miles away from their communities, out of borough or out of London, socially cleansed. And that seems to be the legacy of the Olympic Games for many of Newham's residents. Well, in 2014, on the first anniversary of the campaign, we occupied, as a political occupation for 2.5 weeks, 4 empty flats on the Carpenter's estate. And that was to highlight this issue of empty homes while people being sent away. Until this year, with the election of Roxana Faiz as Mayor of Newham, Robin Wales, as you know, was Labour leader of Newham Council. That was from 1995, and Labour Mayor of Newham from 2002. We went to Robin Wales' surgery in November 2013, and he was the one who, faced with pregnant women and young mothers from Focus E15 hostels, said, if you can't afford to live in Newham, you can't afford to live in Newham. It's become a sort of catchphrase. In 1997, Robin Wales said, there are too many people, those currently living in Newham and those attracted from other London boroughs, who survive on low incomes or who present themselves as homeless. Whilst we offer support and carry out our legislative duties, our aim will be to increase Newham's property values and raise the income profile of all our residents. This last quote was unearthed for us by Debt Resistance UK. And when we met Fanny and Vika and Joel and the other members of that group, we met, activists, researchers, campaigners, and we had our eyes opened, and it was a very important moment for the campaign. We knew a lot of things. We knew about Newham being a borough, 12,000 homeless people, 1 in every 25 residents, the highest in England, the highest number of residents in temporary accommodation in London, one of the boroughs moving the highest number of people outside of the borough, outside of London, and where some of the biggest property value rises had been seen, 400% since 2000. What we didn't know until we met Debt Resistance UK was about LOBO loans and the scandal that we've heard about, and the report says, and we'll hear more about the scandal of council borrowing, the teaser initial rates, and the shocking reality of what actually this situation means for the residents of the borough. Our collaborative work with Debt Resistance UK gave us evidence and proof of corruption. The Labour Council in Newham at that point paying 7.5% interest rates, although we just heard that some are over 10%, and borrowing between 2010 and 2017 rising from 937 million to 1.67 billion pounds, which is equivalent to over 5,000 pounds for each person in the borough. At that time, we collaborated on something called the Newham NAG. I think there's some on the table over there, but that was Debt Resistance UK and Focus E15 campaign. It's a joke about the Newham MAG, which I'm sure you all got, and it's got some real facts. It was quite hard to give out on the stall because people thought we were trying to give them the Newham NAG, and they were going, no, I've seen Robin Wales' picture on every single page, I don't want it, and we say, no, this is different. But it was a very important joint work, and we had a fantastic launch in Newham, and yes, it continue to be read, but it can't be read anymore because he's gone. The upshot of this financial mismanagement, which is scandalous, is that in 2015, Newham paid 70% of its council tax as debt servicing. And by 2016-2017, that had risen to 125%, the highest in England. That means that more than all of what comes in as council tax payment was going straight out to the banks. Those facts that Debt Resistant UK allowed us to know and understand is a massive, important campaigning tool. When you say that to people begin to understand the struggle they're having and why they are in slum accommodation and being sent out, and in temporary accommodation forever. It's not even temporary, and emergency accommodation, etc., etc. Newham Council circulated leaflets in 2015 asking residents of the borough to help work out where they could make savings of £50 million. I mean, that is outrageous in itself. But when you know that the annual debt repayments are £51 million, then you think it's even more outrageous. And Debt Resistance UK taught us that at that time, Newham had increased its usable reserve from £77 million in 2010 to £434 million at that point there. So these are all facts that absolutely aided our ability to explain to people on the streets in housing need what was actually happening at the level of the financial management. It really alarms people who don't have adequate housing to find out that your council is spending significantly less money on housing than on debt repayment to banks for LOBO loans. It's a shocking statement. Newham has a household income much lower than the national median, people being pushed into the unaffordable private rented sector, the benefit cap adding to the increased number of people falling into arrears and facing evictions, and bailiffs at the door, many of which are called by the council. People are in a terrible situation in Newham. And Debt Resistance UK taught us about gambling, and gambling that Robin Wales and Newham Council were quite literally gambling, with the largest casino complex being in Westfield Shopping Mall in Stratford, from where Newham Council was getting £1 million per year in takings. In 2015, Newham Council's pension fund had £88 million invested in offshore Cayman Island registered private equity funds. These are really important facts and people need to know them. In 1845, Friedrich Engels wrote on the living condition of the new industrial working class in London and Manchester: overcrowded slums, dangerous, life-threatening. Now we're 150 years or more on in Britain, and nearly 1/3 of homes of private rental properties are unfit for human habitation as a result of damp, mould, vermin infestations, broken dangerous floors, ceilings, electrical appliances, etc. People living in poverty in the private sector has doubled since 2010, and Shelter estimates that by 2020, 83% of England will become unaffordable for those on housing benefits. We are in a dire situation. We need campaigners, and we need the information that Debt Resistance UK are providing, because it's absolutely vital. Focus E15 campaign is determined to continue the pressure for decent housing for all. We stand against this concept of social cleansing, we stand against the racism in housing, and we say there is no such thing as intentional homelessness. This is this term now being slapped on people who refuse to be moved away from their communities, and when they do so, they are then told they've made themselves intentionally homeless, and the council then discharges their duty to house them. This is intolerable, it must not be tolerated, and must be fought every way along the road. On 15th of October this year, at the council cabinet meeting led by Roxana Faiz, she said these words. I'm sorry she's not here to, this is a direct quote. Oh, hello. She said, the current provision of housing is below par and not acceptable. I am determined to reverse this. The package of measures include a review of allocation policy and out-of-borough policy. We are a council that will challenge existing conditions in London and change the paradigm. It won't happen overnight. If we can't do it here in Newham with a 100% Labour-led council, then they can't do it anywhere. This needs political commitment and determination and tough choices. This is indeed a totally different approach from what we as a campaign experienced under Robin Wales's mayorship. And we welcome Roxana's drive to bring humanity back to those in administration of this borough, and to meet with campaigners and to meet with residents. The period under Robin Wales was mostly Robin Wales setting his security on us at the mayor's show, for instance, and there's ample evidence that you can see online, because we were leafleting people with information and facts. But the task is enormous. To solve the housing problem we face, we need a system that holds land as a common good and decent housing as a human right. And the fight against the housing crisis is definitely a fight against the capitalist system. Focus E15 thanks Debt Resistance UK for their massive contribution to our ability to fight the system, and thank you for the citizen audit of Newham bank debt, a huge amount of work that is part of the struggle for housing justice. Join us on our Saturday stall outside Wilko's on the Broadway, 12 till 2. Come to our meetings, and overall, let's educate, agitate, and organise.
I'm here to tell you about my experience trying to get justice for the people of Newham who have been completely ripped off by the banks and the UK's financial institutions and around the world. So I first heard about LOBO loans and what banks were doing to local councils and local democracy through Joel on Twitter, as I was politically active in the Green Party. And they needed somebody who lived in Newham to object to Newham's accounts and to try this new process that the government has brought in, whereby they save money by getting rid of a government department that scrutinised council spending and leave that to local residents. So you can imagine how well that's going. So when I first started looking at the council's accounts, I knew virtually nothing about the banking system, about local government finance, about derivatives, and I've spent many hours educating myself, because now I realise that billions upon billions of pounds depend on us knowing these things and looking at how councils are being used and abused by the global financial system. And it means that, you know, exactly what we've heard from our fantastic activist Hannah here, about, you know, the consequences of this going on locally. People are actually dying on the streets because our councils are running out of money. Now, I firmly believe that government cuts are wrong and immoral, but there is an alternative to them. We don't have to say, oh, it's the Conservative government's fault. We can go and blame the banks and we can take them to court. So, however, this has not been an easy process by any stretch of the imagination. I've had the amount of emails I've had to send to people who didn't respond to me in the council, or arranged phone calls and be promised things and those things never turn up. I first raised an objection to the council's accounts in 2015, and I had to wait 3 years for any response to come back to me. In that 3 years, the council has sent over £150 million to the banks, while it's cut £150 million from local services. And the auditor said to me, I'm sorry that you've had to wait so long. Well, I'd like them to go and apologise to the people who have lost their homes in Newham because of this inaction. So I was told that if I wanted to see the contracts that the banks had made with the council, I needed to take a day off work and go to the local library where the accounts would be made, where would be opened for me. So I thought, well, that's annoying. I'm self-employed. I earn hundreds of pounds a day, actually, and to lose hundreds of pounds in order to exercise my democratic right, that has. And also all of the work that I've had to do to get to this stage has put some strain on my business. But it's something that I believe in and something that will make life for small businesses in Newham much better. So it is really worth doing. So I got to the library on time. I asked to see the accounts. The accounts were not there. The documents that I requested were not there. And everyone seemed bewildered that I'd turned up. And they said, well, you'll have to speak to the auditors. So I emailed the auditors. The auditors made an appointment with me, and the contracts were emailed. Now, they were heavily redacted, making it quite difficult to understand exactly what was going on. But the one thing that I did spot in one of the contracts was that they were pegged to LIBOR, which is something that I've learned is basically, in a lot of these contracts, the banks were lending based on the national interest rate that's set by the banks and is supposed to be agreed by all of the banks. However, Barclays had been busy fiddling the figures. So they were basically lending to Newham on false pretenses. Now, I raised this with the auditor at the time, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and they looked at the contract, and they looked at me, and they were silent. And then they said, yes, you've got a good point there. And I never heard from them again. A year later, I was notified by email that Ernst & Young were taking over the audit contract for Newham Council. And then for another year, there was silence. And then Ernst & Young sent me their response to the objection. By this time, it was this year, I think, Joel? Something, yeah. In the meantime, I'd raised another objection in 2017 to the previous year's accounts. I still haven't heard anything about that, but that's another story. So Ernst & Young responded to me saying that they probably didn't think my objection was valid, and they weren't going to take the council to court, and here's why. So they sent me this big report, and I spent many, many hours trawling through it and finding all the points where they'd failed to do their job properly. And if someone like me, I went to art college. I'm a fundraiser. If it takes me to spot the massive flaws in the work of the auditor, what is going on? And I think I know what's going on, because most of these auditors that are doing this work, they're being paid tens of millions of pounds by the councils. But they're getting hundreds of millions of pounds from the financial institutions that sold these products to the councils in the first place. So if you're an audit firm and you have a choice between losing those giant contracts with the banks or doing a dodgy job on the council's audit, which are you going to choose? Even the auditors themselves admit that this shouldn't be happening, and then it should be an independent body that we used to have that should be scrutinising this kind of thing. I feel like, as a resident of Newham, I have been the victim of a crime. And the police who are investigating the crime are being paid by the perpetrator of the crime to investigate it. That isn't justice. And there's just, I feel, I don't have the might of a big party behind me. I don't get paid to do this. In fact, I'm actively losing money in order to do it. But I feel that victory is within our grasp. The fact that we have two brave councillors who were willing to stand up publicly and put their reputation and their political careers on the line, that gives me a lot of hope. So thank you to John Whitworth for taking that, for being so brave. One of the things that actually scared me while I was doing this and made it very difficult to carry on was the fact that auditors made veiled threats to me. The response from elected councillors, some elected councillors, was openly hostile towards me, even though this work could result in tens of millions of pounds back for the people of Newham, for better environmental services, for better adult social care, for housing homeless people and building council housing that we all really want. So if you want to know more about exactly the flaws in the auditor's response, I won't go into them here because it's quite boring, to be honest, but the consequences are huge. And if you go away from this event with anything, I would ask you to go and look at the debt resistance website, lada.debtresistance.uk. Is that right? Yeah. And look up if you have friends in any other councils who haven't been challenged on their loans, please tell everyone you know about it, because we need more people to raise objections. And the debt resistance team are fantastic, and they've been so supportive throughout the process. So we just need more people to do this and exercise their legal right. And who knows, we might be able to end austerity for local councils without the help of the government.
Early in 2015, when a couple of my colleagues, one of whom the current mayor, and also another councillor, John Gray, who's also here present, they were talking about these mysterious LOBOs and as being a threat to the council's finances and rather a millstone around the necks. But I didn't really learn much more until I saw the dispatches programme focused on council debt in the UK, and particularly in Newham with the LOBOs. And that Newham actually had more exposure to LOBOs than any other council in the UK, £563 million. It was a shocking revelation to me. And a couple of weeks later, Parliament's Select Committee for Communities and Local Government focused on this. I think Abhishek has already mentioned it. And there I learnt a lot more, although only began to learn this very obscure and highly complex phenomena. And in fact, I must say I am still very much a non-specialist, so I'm only going to talk about my experience really of the campaign, and I'm absolutely not going to talk about the financial aspects. But at this meeting of the Select Committee, we met some I went with John and Roxana. We met some interesting people, including Abhishek and Joel, and they continued to advise us on what we could do to actually free Newham of this terrible burden. And it was really, I can only echo what the previous speakers have said, how terrible it is to see that money which should be going into council resident services is actually being hived off with the banks by these huge interest rates. Terrible situation, which we tried to address in Newham, and following advice, we asked questions in Council and Labour Group on a number of occasions over a couple of year period. Questions about the amount of money we were paying to service these loans, amount of money draining from the council's resources, the risks we had for the future, because we were tied into these loans for decades to come with prohibited exit clauses, and it was really quite a nightmare to see what hold the LOBOs had over us. When we asked questions, though, we were given more or less always the same answer, that they were examples of prudent borrowing, that it was sound financial practice, and this was repeated time and again by the Mayor and the Cabinet Member for Finance. Now, the reason, of course, is behind this is between 2002 and 2010, these loans had been taken out by Newham Council. The council officers who had been responsible for the negotiations were all long gone, but the Mayor and Cabinet Member for Finance were still there, and they, of course, very careful to polish up their image, did not want to be seen to have done wrong and made a mistake. And so this is what it was all about, really. They did not want to admit the mistake, and so they said, LOBOs are no problem. And when we kept asking, what are you going to do about this? They said, well, we don't need to do anything, because it is, and they said it is actually published in council papers, that we are actually saving money. It was declared in the council papers that Newham was saving money as a result of having contracted the LOBO loan. So this is the kind of response we got over a couple of year periods, until we did actually find out in February 2017, it was admitted actually that many of the loans with Barclays, £248 million worth of the range LOBOs with Barclays, had been restructured. And this had made savings, I think, of £94 million. Now, how could they make savings when it was such a good deal in the first place? This was never explained. And when we asked questions, we were told, I remember the council, the Cabinet Member for Finance saying things like, if I had a crystal ball, and there were several other, there's another councillor present here as well, remembers this. If I had a crystal ball, I'd be a rich man if I could see the future. He gave us this kind of answer. And the Mayor began to get impatient, saying, oh, we've had all this time and time again, we keep giving you the same answer. Yes, the same answer without answering the question. So this was the kind of stonewalling we had. Early on, though, in the campaign, my colleagues wanted to inspect the accounts for 2014-15. Again, it was Roxana and John. And as members of the council, and Roxana was a member of the audit board, they met with all sorts of obstacles. It was proved very difficult for the councillors actually to inspect the accounts during the period where the public can see them. And so I applied, not as a councillor, but as a resident, and it proved much easier. It does tell you the climate that was reigning at the time, it was easier for a resident to view the accounts than it was for a councillor. John did actually come with me, and we received some information from the accounts, but we were given much more actually by what Druck had found out previously, and what Joel was able to pass on to us. And we found out the extent of the loans, and the fact that they were 27 of them taken out between 2002 and 2010, with a number of different banks, including 2 foreign banks. So we found out this information mainly through for debt resistance. But having seen the accounts and got a bit of information, in February 2016, that is the following February, I placed an objection with accounts and asked the auditors, PricewaterhouseCoopers, to prepare a public interest report and present it to the council. And here my experience parallels that of Rachel. Got an acknowledgement to the objection, and then nothing more, except I did get an invitation to meet the Director of Finance of Newham Council. I went to see her, and she said, I've been appointed to this post because I am a financial expert, and you should respect my professional judgment when I tell you that these LOBO loans are a perfectly good deal for the council, and so you should stop all this nonsense. And I said, well, I'm afraid I've heard otherwise from people who I also regard as experts in the field. And so we left it at that. And but she did say, I expect to get some information, preliminary results from PricewaterhouseCoopers in about 3 months. Well, this time period passed, and I contacted them again in June, and they said, we're no longer doing this. And as Rachel said, it was passed over to Ernst & Young. And it was proved a bit difficult to get a contact at Ernst & Young. But I did have an email exchange over a few months, and each time I was promised that preliminary findings would be presented. But it wasn't until, in fact, July 2017, that's 18 months after I'd lodged the objection, that I received the preliminary findings. And like Rachel, they refused. They suggested that they would refuse the objection, and I can give you 1 or 2 details of what they said. And it was really a chapter of excuses. They recognised some of the points that I had considered to be unlawful, but they kept making excuses and producing and quoting mitigating factors. Excuse me. Yeah, I will just give you a few details of this preliminary findings that they did give me after 18 months. Ernst & Young refused in their provisional report to uphold my rejection to the 2014 accounts because although they identified a series of actions I considered to be unlawful in the taking out of the council's LOBO agreements, they either ignored them or didn't consider them to be sufficiently serious. Now, such actions that they recognised were borrowing from 2 non-UK lenders without Treasury approval, failing to set a maximum variable percentage rate for borrowing in line with SIPFA guidance, ramping up variable rate LOBO borrowing to 90% of the council's debt portfolio, borrowing so many speculative inverse floater and range LOBOs without benchmarking them across the lifetime of the loan. Furthermore, at the time of this report, Ernst & Young had a conflict of interest as the panel auditor for the Royal Bank of Scotland, who had sold us the inverse floater loans, which I understand from the expert are particularly pernicious to the borrower. They also noted that Barclays range LOBOs, as I said before, would make a savings of £94 million, but they didn't seek to inquire into why this saving would be made, without really referring to the fact that they would be to the detriment of the holding of these loans previously. They also didn't question, they didn't seem to contact any of the, just try to contact any of the council officers involved who had left the council. I gave my response based on what I've just said, and again, it was a question of waiting. I had to wait I had to wait until April this year. That was 2 years and 3 months after first objecting, before the final report. And the final report essentially backed up their findings that they gave in their provisional report. And they said that they turned down my objection and just made a chapter of excuses. During this time, I did attend a couple of AGMs, which were helped and facilitated by Joel. The Barclays AGM in April 2016, where I asked a question, of whether they would consider releasing Newham from the obligations with the punitive breakage clauses. And I did get the response that, Barclays were considering reviewing some of their contracts because they were not such a good deal for them either. And then I heard no more, but and I don't know whether this had any influence in the fact that the loans were restructured subsequently, or some of them were. Anyway, I didn't know what the result of that was, didn't hear anything. And this year, actually, I went to the Royal Bank of Scotland AGM in Edinburgh, again facilitated by Joel, and I asked, because the chairman of the Royal Bank of Scotland, Sir Howard Davis, he had criticised PFIs before, and he had called them a fraud from the people. And then, so I asked him, having been given this information, why he was borrowing cheaply from the government and lending more dearly to councils, and in fact carrying out an analogous procedure with the councils that he was criticising PFI for. And I also asked if he could give us details of the negotiations they'd carried out with councils for LOBO loans between 2009 and 2012. So Howard said that an official would speak to me after the meeting, which they did, and said that they were renewing contacts with Newham Council. So that is another story which perhaps I'm sure Roxana can take up. So there is the story of the ups and downs, mostly downs of the campaign, and the long series of stonewalling, not only by our council, which we can understand very well, our previous council, I mean, but also by the auditors, who were obviously working hand in hand with complicity with the council that they were supposed to be scrutinising. So thank you very much.
I remember sitting in a Canary Wharf coffee bar doing this, because I was just thinking, here we go again. Every time the city waltzes up and comes to a council or to a business or someone and say, hey, take a look at this, it's great, it's a fantastic deal for you. You know that it's all going to blow up in the future and go horribly, horribly wrong. And this is one of the more graphic example of this. You've heard about interest rate swaps. That was an earlier one. This one is particularly problematic because of the way that commercial loans are regulated. And the Financial Conduct Authority looks at a borrower like a council, and they refer to them as a sophisticated borrower. Now, what a sophisticated borrower means is that basically they know what they're doing, allegedly. you or I, we get some protection because obviously we're just individuals and we don't know what we're doing when we're set against a massive bank with the terms and conditions in their contracts and whatever. So we have access to things like the Financial Services Ombudsman, complaint schemes and regulators we can go to and complain. A sophisticated borrower does not. And a sophisticated borrower can encompass everyone from really quite small enterprises, micro businesses, to council. Nobody is a sophisticated borrower when it comes to dealing with banks and derivative contracts and the sort of things they do. They always have the upper hand, they always know what they're talking about, and they can always very effectively pull the wool over their eyes. Anyway, we move on a little while into the future, and I thought I'd just have a bit of fun and have a look at Newham's accounts after the loans with Barclays were, rejigged and sorted out, and everything was looking a little bit better. So I sort of had a little poke about into the numbers. It's fascinating reading local authority accounts. I recommend it to everyone. It's a real thriller. Anyway, I found something really quite staggering, because even though these debts were sorted out and restructured and fixed up and generally supposed to be saving the council 1.6 million a year, which is great, and we're all pleased about that, the borrowing had actually gone up. And I thought, hang on, this can't be true. We know there are still some LOBOs on the books, and we know they're nasty with Royal Bank of Scotland. I encourage you to badger and campaign and make a lot of noise about this, because it's the only way you're going to get them restructured, and they need restructuring. They are awful. They are terrible terms and conditions, and they are really skewering the borough of Newham, which really doesn't need skewering for all the reasons you've heard. So anyway, I had a poke about in this, and I found that there was a massive increase in debt interest repayments to something like 125% of council tax equivalent. And anyway, I thought I'd approach Newham Council and say, hey, what's going on? Now, spin doctors are spin doctors. I'm not going to complain that organisations have them, because they do need someone to speak on their behalf. But Newhams don't speak to anyone, it seems. Certainly not to journalists. You have a press office, and you kind of wonder what they do all day. Sit in meetings and strategizing and saying, oh, shall we have Nescafe coffee, or shall we have Tetley tea, or shall we have Typhoo? That seems to me to be what they were spending all day doing, because they certainly weren't answering a really simple question. What's going on here? Why has your interest gone on? Anyway, I basically decided I was going to ring them every day and make a real pain in the neck of myself. And that's the best way to get an answer in these situations. And so I did get an answer, and it was this. This year's interest payable and similar charges include a one-off impairment of a financial instrument. Now, I'm supposed to be reasonably sophisticated. I don't know what the hell that means. What is a one-off impairment of a financial instrument? Apparently it wasn't related to LOBO loans. I don't know whether that's true or not. You tell me. But, there you have it. So anyway, I went back to the council and I want to say, what on earth do you mean by that? I'm used to taking a heap of rubbish from press officers of one kind or another. Government ones are notorious for it. You'll ask them a question in the morning and nothing will happen, so you'll put your piece up and then suddenly they'll be ringing up and crying saying, Liam Fox is really quite upset, but you're saying his trade deals will skewer disabled people. We want to get our side in. Well, I told you about that. Well, can we get our side in? And to and fro. And eventually they'll come up with a quote, and it will be a bland restatement of government policy saying everything's going to be all right. In other words, it will be a lie. But you will get a response. Not from Newham. I called again, and I called again. And, it eventually came time, and I just put it up. I thought, if I put it up online, usually what happens then is you'll get the call and they'll get upset and they'll say, well, they want to write a letter, or, you know, you didn't give us a chance to comment, even though I did. So I put it up. You know, blank silence, absolutely nothing. I recently did an investigation into weed killer. There's a rather nasty chemical called glyphosate or Roundup, which I disturbingly found I'd got in my garage. And the World Health Organization says this stuff causes cancer. So anyway, you know, we did a digging around and we found out that they'd be using dodgy tactics and set up this campaign of grassroots farmers when in fact it was all funded and run by Monsanto and their PR companies. And I wondered whether I'd get a bit of difficulty with Bayer, who now own Monsanto, about this, because they're a notoriously uncommunicative organisation. They spend some weeks sometimes getting back to your query. And it took a few days, but I even got an email back from Bayer saying, blah, 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 everything's all right, really, but we're going to review our PR tactics now, so thanks very much, and, you know, there you go. If Bayer can answer a question like that, and Bayer is a secretive, massive German corporation, why on earth can't Newham answer a really simple question about what's going on in its accounts, what's happening to this public money, and why, you know, people aren't getting the services they need because of these one-off impairment, blah, 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 on the sophisticated blah, 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 gobble, 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 blah, blah, blah. So, anyway, that's what I want to know from Newham. If someone from Newham would like to ring me up in the next couple of days and tell me up with this one-off impairment, with this, I'll be happy as a pig in whatever. I encourage you guys to make the same sort of fuss, because it's the only way that a response is going to come. What I think about all this is that Newham has made a horrible series of cock-ups down the line, really doesn't want to admit it, because we know in this country only too well how people don't like admitting the mistakes and don't like rectifying them. They'd just rather sweep it under the carpet and hope people forgets about it. Oh, Brexit, sorry. But, you know, Newham, I think, really has to admit here, we made a god-awful mistake with these loans, and we need to do something about it. I'm very pleased to hear that they are suing Barclays, because they should, and they should sue Royal Bank of Scotland and the whole bally lot of them. Thanks very much.
I just wanted to start off by saying it's a real privilege to be here. And actually, it's a real privilege to be in Newham and walk around, you know. And listening to what we've heard tonight, you just realise what is being messed up for people here. You know, you come to a lovely place like this, and you know, actually, from the other report that you've done, exactly how people's lives are being messed up, and exactly what people are facing, and people extreme health problems, some people dying. And I also kind of want to get back to the core of really what we're talking about in terms of what's going on in our democracy. What's going on as a result, partly of austerity, but partly things that started way before austerity. Austerity just kind of worsens this, and give actually. Joe and his colleagues asked me to just give a little bit of a kind of perspective on this, particularly thinking about regulation and what's happened to regulation and social protection. I'm going to use these words, social protection, because when we talk about austerity, I think we tend to not really realise the full scope of social protection that has been not just undermined, but has been destroyed deliberately in this country by a government that does not care about social protection, that thinks that the market, the financial system will look after people and things can be financialised. And that, you know, if we look at, you know, some of the things, I'm not going to repeat the stuff about housing and about people losing their homes and being forced onto the street, the rise in homelessness so much. I'm not going to talk about the emasculation of social care. We know about that, the violence against, the violence of austerity against particularly disabled people. So I'm not going to, that we've heard about from some of the speakers. But I do just want to say that what has also happened is the fabric of regulation. So the The public servants that we rely on to protect us from business has been wholly eroded at a local authority level and at a national level. Some local authorities now don't even have any health and safety inspectors left, right? Some local, I don't know about Newham, but if you want to know more about this, my colleague Steve Toombs has written a really good book called Social Protection After the Crisis, where he identifies some local authorities who are responsible for regulating thousands and thousands of workplaces, don't even have inspectors to go out there. That's a measure. Workers are not protected. Workers in some of the most dangerous workplaces are not protected. And by the way, the local authority is responsible for regulating some of those warehouse locations where the most casualised 0 hours workers are working. So the scope of this undermining of social protection, I think, is really important. And the phrase, I think it was Fanny that said this earlier that stuck with me, is that what we've got is a kind of shift from the political to administrative decisions, pure administrative decisions. So if you are told you're intentionally, I agree with who's intentionally homeless. Absolutely. If you're told that, you've got no recourse because it's told to you as an administrative decision that you can't challenge politically. You can't. So there's a replacement of social relationships with purely administrative, and I would say now financialized. There's a financialization of our social fabric that's going on. I'm going to kind of make a few. Give you a few examples. I think financialization of social protection, that's what I want to talk about. I'm an academic. Academics like to throw in a word like that. And even on a Tuesday night, like to dig out an academic definition. Sorry, I'm not going to apologize. I'm just going to read the definition. Financialization, according to Gerard Epstein, the well-known expert, I'm being serious. I think it's a good basic definition. What academics would say financialization is. It refers to the increasing importance of financial markets, financial motives, financial institutions, and financial elites in the operation of the economy and its governing institutions, both at the national and international levels. That's financialization. What we've heard tonight is it's happening at local levels. It's happening intensively also at local levels. Financialization is really the logic, the social logic, the logic of social relationships that's driving all of what we're talking about tonight. I think LOBOs are a key measure of that social process of financialization. And we've heard actually what that means in terms of regulation. We heard about the Audit Commission and the abolition of the Audit Commission, and partly that's about privatising. As you said, it's partly about individualizing, privatizing a regulatory function amongst citizens, but it's also, as was pointed out, it's financialized. So we have the big four accounting firms now regulating local authorities, not just local authorities, but all kinds of social provision in all kinds of ways. Research for Action also exposed this in the context of Grenfell, and actually the Grenfell inquiry was exposed when it was found that KPMG was auditing the inquiry. KPMG, the same company that was the auditor for the Kensington and Chelsea TMO, and the auditor for Ryden, the main contractor in Grenfell. So that financialization of regulation is really important. The financial logics that are being used to regulate, so no wonder we get responses like this, right? Because it makes sense to these financial elites. Of course it doesn't make sense to us, but it makes sense, that logic. And we could actually go on, the kind of where that logic is. If I was to stay, we could talk all night about Grenfell and the logic of financialized regulation in Grenfell. You'll have heard many of you people talk about those desktop surveys where companies are effectively allowed to test fire safety regulations using their own models, using their own consultants that they pay for. Not only that, some of you might have heard of a private regulator called BRE Global. BRE Global is probably the most important advisor, one of the most important advisors to government on regulatory standards. Gave a clean bill of health to regulatory standards for cladding and insulation in 2016. That's the private regulator the government has to listen to, stuffed full of individuals who've been appointed by private building firms. And we could really, honestly, we could talk about that financialization of regulation at the heart of Grenfell. the way in which the 2005, was it 2005? I'm trying to remember the name of the, I thought I had it on my notes. Yeah, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Act in 2005 got rid of local authority fire inspections, replaced it with private consultants, the financialisation of regulation. And another character, actually, Joel did ask me to talk about specifically about a character who's kind of important in some of this, not in all of this. This doesn't come down to particular individuals that governments appoint, but I think this character is quite important. He was the guy that Labour appointed in 2004 to review regulatory standards. He was called Philip Hampton. A very interesting kind of character, and his entire career, both before and after the Hampton report that he did for the Blair government that was then implemented partly by Gordon Brown, his entire career is in the finance sector. So he starts off with Coopers Lybrand, the forerunners to PricewaterhouseCoopers. He then works for Lazar Brothers, the big investment bank, has this financial career. He's the guy they appoint to set up the new regulatory standards. And one thing I want to say about what happened in that period, which I think is very, very important, of course, probably the most important moment of re-regulation of the finance industry that we're talking about was the Big Bang in the 80s, was Thatcher, and was, you know, what happened after that. But without kind of getting into that, what Hampton did was he put a principle of economic progress, were the words he used, at the heart of regulation. Now, without getting into kind of the ins and outs of exactly what happened, that economic progress, that became something, and I'll read out the quote from the Hampton report, that all regulators, not just financial regulators, but also social regulators, the Environment Agency, the Health and Safety Executive, had to bring into their to the mainstream of their regulatory activities. Regulators should recognize that a key element of their activity will be to allow or even encourage economic progress and to only intervene when there is a clear case for protection. That's the financialization of regulation, the principles at the heart of our system. The Tories used that, by the way. The Tories loved it. They loved all that stuff because they basically embedded it in all kinds of policies. So we now have a growth duty in the 2015 Deregulation Act introduced by the Tories, which says that every single regulator has to take growth, economic growth, take account of economic growth in their decisions. In their decisions whether they prosecute, in the decisions whether they issue warnings, or the decisions even to inspect in the first place. So I guess once we've got that embedded as a principle across the board in regulation, we have to say we've got two dilemmas, actually. We've got a dilemma in terms of the privatization and financialization of the regulators. So we've got the turkeys who are not going to vote for Christmas, right? That's to put it in very crude terms. We've got everything we've heard. The people who are in control, who work with a financial rationale, are not going to regulate on our behalf on one side. And on the other side, even the public servants, we don't value some of our public servants. I mean, health and safety inspectors right now, 47% cut since 2010, right? And their bosses are telling them not allowed to enforce regulation. Environment Agency inspectors, these public servants we really value, now they're hamstrung, their hands are tied because they have to take into account growth. So, what's the point? I think the point is probably that we need to go use the lessons of this discussion that we're having here to think about what this means for the way we regulate predatory business. The banksters, not just the banksters, but the Amazons, the Deliveroos, the companies that are also involved because they're not regulated properly, enforcing conditions down to rock bottom, where people are being injured. So I think we have to make the links across the whole economy. We have to identify and point the finger at the financialization of the regulation of business, and we have to sever the logic and practice of regulation from financialization. I'd like to hear your ideas on how we do that, of course. But it's not in isolation. Like we've heard today, there are organisations that some of us know and work with who are challenging that in the workplaces, right? There have been several strikes involving 0 hours workers. In fact, I missed. I got a bit too late today to be on the IWGB picket line today. So there are there are people resisting the financialisation of regulation, but that's a much bigger job that we've got, I think. But this is a really important, really important struggle at the heart of it. So thank you.
Can I just apologise for the impenetrable culture that was Newham before I stepped in 6 months ago. And I just wanted to relay a recent short story to give you a sense that what you experienced is not dissimilar to some of the things that I've been experiencing as the newly directly elected mayor for Newham, having stepped into the role after someone having been in the position for a significant period of time, and combined with that person's role as leader of the council, I think we calculated some 23 years. And it's really important that that I ask you to just hold on to that 23 years number, and I'm going to explain the reason why. So I stepped into a council that has become really ossified in its thinking, that has been shaped in the image of one person, that is actually quite deeply traumatized, that doesn't know institutionally whether or not it can think, let alone understanding that it's allowed to think in terms of the individual people that make up a council that should be responsive to our residents. And it was one of the things that I talked quite passionately about when I was seeking selection to become the official Labour Party candidate for the Mayor of Newham, having drawn on my experience as a councillor. And part of that experience was shaped by the struggles that both myself, John Gray, and latterly John Whitworth, Councillor John Whitworth, had encountered when we got to grips with the serious issue of our LOBO liability. It was, our attention was drawn to it. Actually, I think it was you, John. You clocked a tweet from Joel, and then you began to engage with Joel. And we rapidly realised this was circa January 2015, not long after I got elected for the first time back in May 2014. And we knew that we were on the precipice of uncovering something hugely significant, not just in the context of what this illustrated about the way in which the council operation was being managed by a political hegemony that had gained the instruments of control in this council and had put so much stock on its proficiency in treasury management and financial proficiency that anyone that dared to question that it was something not quite right was intimidated, was shut down, was made to feel ridiculous, was ascribed characteristics of being either a nutcase or a rabid trot. All of these things that you just expect you would have just ditched when you were a student, doing all your student politics stuff. But no, fast forward to 2014 to 18, and it was very much alive and well and kicking in Newham under the auspices of the previous administration. And I used to joke how when we were being told things by my predecessor, whether that was reality or whether that was a parallel universe that was Newham. But I'm really proud of the work that John Gray and Councillor John Gray, John Whitworth, working alongside the heroic efforts, actually, of Joel and his team, UK Debt Resistance, and the brilliance of Abhishek, who actually we lent on quite a lot in terms of understanding something that was pretty complex and was actually seismic in light of the comments that you've made around the privatisation of the financial sector, the way that has led to an acceleration of a technocracy that runs and operates at local authority level, the diminishing of democratic legitimacy. It's accelerated a crisis in democracy, these things. And I was really clear that I wanted to be part of a movement that began to reverse that. And I was one person of 5 way back in 2014 that were really clear that we wanted to be part of a change movement in Newham. And whilst we were part of the Labour Party here in Newham, we couldn't subscribe to a political ideology and philosophy that was being driven by my predecessor. But we had to be very careful. There were huge significant risks of us losing the whip and being thrown out of Labour group, and then being even more marginalised. The experiences of Rachel as a resident trying to access information, everyone sounded or reacted in a very shocked way, but seriously, the things that John Whitworth described in terms of our ability as elected representatives in a Labour-run council totally controlled by Labour, and our inability to get information was absolutely shocking. But part of that I understand now is because of the way in which the institution had evolved, in the way in which my predecessor needed and wanted for his own survival. So I was very clear that if I was to be selected, which I was, and then subsequently elected, which I was in May, I stepped into office on May the 8th. And in July, I made an announcement that Newham Council, under my administration, we had issued a protective claim, which is the initial phase of legal action against Barclays in relation to a set of the LOBO loans. There are 27, amounting to just over £500 million. I absolutely hear the arguments that Hannah from Focus C15 has made in terms of the implications of those huge sums and the interests that we're paying, in terms of what that has translated to the disinvestment in our people and the loss of social value. And I am bringing back a vocabulary of social value in everything that we do as a council. But I am having to turn a huge ship that has been shaped over a process spanning 23 years. That's a generation, a quarter of a century. I am, as mentioned previously, dealing with an organisation that is deeply traumatised. I am having to bring in external expertise to help me gain assurances about the books. So one of my pledges was clean up the books as part of the clean-up process. I know that year one for me has to be defined by pressing the reset button, everything back to normal. Because at the moment, Newham is, well, up until the point I got elected and stepped into office, Newham really wasn't normal by any stretch of the imagination in some serious critical areas relative to what you would find in another local authority. So in addition to the protective claim that we've issued against Barclays, And unfortunately, and I trust you, bear with me on this one, I can't go into the detail because I risk jeopardizing our position and our ability to robustly fight this claim. But once this is all done and over, and once we win, and we will win, I'll be more than happy to come back and explain to everyone or tell the story in terms of the drama that is presently unfolding, albeit it's a quiet one. But Abhishek has been a real help in some of our early thinking around this. I know that the LOBO contracts were restructured about a year and a half ago. They were under the previous administration, but that was largely driven by Barclays needing to make adjustments for its own sort of balance sheet as opposed to anything to do with the council. You know, there's an issue of trust as the new leader of a new administration of officers. So particularly officers at senior level. I've currently got an interim chief executive in, and I've given clear instruction that I want for there to be a sense check of the senior management team. There is a long-standing history in Newham where people curiously find themselves getting a job, and you're just thinking, how does that happen? So there's been a couple of exits and departures. It's all part of the clean-up exercise, and I pulled in SITFA, which is the network of finance officers representing local government to do a budget health check. I'm astounded every single week and every single day at some of the things that I'm uncovering, and I try not to get dispirited. Well, actually, I don't get dispirited. I just kind of feel the weight of the world on my shoulders, and as do my cabinet members, of which John Gray is one. And I desperately want to be able to demonstrate material change to show Newham residents that we genuinely are on their side. I'm having to do lots of pushback, lots of gentle hollering, making it very clear to officers that, whilst local government has a history of operating on the basis of hierarchy, you have officers who are grade 1, and then you have down the line grade 24, whatever it is, and I'm really not interested in my information flow being mediated. I'm as interested in speaking to colleagues that work on the front line, in fact, more interested in speaking to colleagues on the front line, as I am with immersing myself in the field, speaking to voluntary sector organisations, Jane from Magpie Project, Hannah. We've begun to we formalised quarterly meetings, and we had our first formal meeting on Saturday, which actually was quite heart-wrenching for me. I was so angry, and I'll tell you why. And I have said to them, I need to be able to gain information on my own terms in my own way and be able to triangulate it, because in the age of local government, which is accelerated as a consequence of austerity into these huge bureaucracies that are driven and led and shaped by technocrats, and the power and the potency of politics and your idealism of wanting to change the world is beginning to dissipate because politicians are too scared, or they're not willing to dream the impossible. But actually the impossible isn't impossible, it is possible. You just need to have focus and determination. I want to bring that all back, but it's going to take me a little while. But we're getting there, slowly but surely. So some other things. We've got, would you believe, and this goes back to a comment that Hannah made, there are homes in Newham that are simply not fit for human habitation, which is why it's a key feature of my manifesto. We have £120 million in our HRA account that's just been sat there. We're going through a process of reconfiguring the budget. We are getting to grips with all of this stuff that's been allowed to fester. It's not made me popular amongst some of my returning councillors who are aggrieved that I'm in a sense, put in the spotlight, but in their minds, what's the phraseology? Wash your dirty linen in public, washing your dirty clothes in public. So I think they're upset with me about that, and I'm needing to still duck and dive, but I'll survive. But it's a huge privilege to be in this position, and I don't take any day for granted. And I'm absolutely resolutely focused on ensuring that I deliver, largely because I grew up in the borough and I love this borough so much. And everyone in this room and everyone outside and communities across the borough are part of my family. And two significant issues that I will be addressing. One is the housing related stuff, and last week announced £107 million that we've been awarded from the Mayor of London, the highest of any London borough, to kickstart our social housing programme. And youth safety. The level of disinvestment in our youth provision has been frankly criminal. And I'm having a series of discussions with officers and colleagues about reshaping the budget. This year's budget is going to be a transitional budget. We're still needing to carry some things from the previous administration, only because the 6 months that we've been in office has not been sufficient amount of time to be able to repurpose it appropriately. We're still needing to do deep dive, but there's a lot to fix. But I'm really proud and thrilled to be able to stand here and show everyone in this room that when you are determined and when you work with like-minded people and when you make those connections and when you have really forceful campaigners like Joel, like Hannah from Focus E15, intellectuals and experts like Abhishek, the journalists that put a spotlight on this stuff, we all coalesce and we can begin to change. And, I'm here at the service of all of you here, as well as doing right for Newham residents and getting our money back. And, basically we need to challenge the banks and challenge these institutions that are basically screwing up and we're having to pay. So I'm going to end it there because I think I've spoken way too long, but I hope that's given you an indication of the task at hand. And thank you very much.
So let's take the three first questions. Can we start from the front?
The first couple of speakers that spoke regards to campaigning work that needs to be done, as well as the legal discussion we've had about legal action and stuff like that. Because my name's Donna Guthrie. I'm the National Women's Officer for Barack UK, which is Black Activists Rising Against the Cuts, an anti-austerity campaign that was set up in 2010 to highlight the disproportionate impact on the black communities of austerity. And we've talked about the impact tonight of the decisions that have been taken by local authorities, but also in the climate of austerity, but also the financial institutions that have run reckless and put us into serious debt that our communities are suffering from. And what I wanted to reflect on, and wanted you someone to reflect on, is the type of campaigning work that needs to be done alongside to build up the campaign that links the conditions that people are suffering under austerity with the stripping of financial resources of our local authorities. Because actually, in 2010, around that time, I remember being one of many residents in the borough and campaigners that was outside Newham Council under its first budget cuts meetings that had the police called on them. Do you know what I mean? And we were attacked by the police. A school student was assaulted. Lots of people were trying to stand up to what was going on with regards to the decimation of their lives that has subsequently occurred. And what I'm proud of now is that I'm now a Labour Party member in this borough with a new administration under Roxana, and many new councillors that are going to be helping to uncover and release us from some of this debt. But I'd like to hear more about the campaigning work that we should be doing as residents, and we're now going to be free to do, and we should all unite to do.
John Whitworth, your objections you objected to the audit, objected to the accounts, and they sent you a letter. Or is that a letter or a report which explained their excuses? Yeah. Is that in any of the documentation? The letter that you received and you read it out. Do we get access to that?
Should we get back to that? Yeah, let's get back to that in the question. There's a bit more of a story behind why none of these
you
replies have been shared.
One or two things in there, unless that's part of the legal case, and maybe you don't. I understand if it's part of the legal case. I just wondered what their reasoning behind your rejecting your objections to the accounts was. You've gone on about like Robin Wells and Big Bad Robin and all this, and how he's like screwed up all the council and everything. And I think we can always see that things were there's big problems with like right wingers running organisations for significant lengths of time, and it leads to half-baked policy, and that's exactly what was said at the end of Margaret Thatcher's regime. Was the same thing, half-baked policy, things aren't thought through on all this. Of course, the problem with this, these LOBO loans was that they weren't, it wasn't just at the end of the administration that they were taking them out, it was all the way through since 2002, I think. But what I was just going to say, is this like things like this? Because you're taking the you're taking the company to court for these LOBO loans, but isn't the problem with like things like this Newham Mag thing? Aren't they just going to say, "Whoa, we're fine. We ain't done nothing wrong. It's Big Bad Robin. He's to blame. Big Bad Robin. He didn't know what he was doing. He's like a dictator and all the stuff which is in here." Aren't they just going to put it all down on Robin and say, "Oh, it's all Robin's fault. He didn't know what he was doing. He bad decision making, donuts in the council, in the cabinet, and all this." Aren't they just going to blame it all on Robin as well and say,
that is a good question.
Paul Watt from Birkbeck University of London. Two very simple questions for Roxana, John, and Joel. The first question is, who actually signed off the LOBO loans in the council? And the second question is more speculative, and again for the same three of you, is what was the rationale for why this was done? And was it in any way connected with the way that Newham one of the ways that the previous regime claimed that it was doing a good job for Newham residents was that it kept council tax, it didn't increase council tax for many years. So was there some interconnection then between the loans and the not raising the tax, basically?
My name's John, I'm a local resident here. So I learned a lot of things today, but one of them was the actions of the past administration. So, but also conflict of interest of accounting firms. So my question would be directed to Roxana, Fiaz and John Whitworth is, what procedures are being in place to prevent future audit and accounting firms from having a conflict of interest? And my second question would be, what future changes would there be to a council, or should there be changes to the council to prevent abuse of executive power?
Look, I can only talk about the campaign that was done for the interest rate swap disputes. That's nearly 7 or 8 years old now, and even still we're getting mainstream publication coverage for that. I think the trick with that is to keep trying to contract mainstream news publications. The Independent James here is in the very, very rare minority of actually having written something about this in the mainstream press. I do not know why, genuinely, other than the obvious reason of trying to sort of keep a lid on this, why the mainstream press are not looking at this. I've probably put clients and case studies 60 or 70 times in the media for businesses that have been badly treated by banks, and yet for local authorities, other than a little bit in the Evening Standard and the Independent by Good James here, effectively no one else has really written about that. So the mainstream press is absolutely key for this, and just keep trying to do that, just like what the Channel 4 Dispatches programme did. And just on, someone asked a question about big bad Sir Robin Wales, or not Sir, whether he's a Sir or not, but isn't it just his fault? The whole point about the current legal action that Newham has initiated and the other councils have initiated is it's not about who signed what at the council, why did they enter into it, etc., etc. Those are important questions, and happy to debate all of that, but actually that isn't part of the kind of legal claim that's going on now.
Abhishek's making the right, correct point that the local authorities that are making and have submitted protective claims and are pursuing this through the legal route are doing it predicated on fact and not on casting aspersions on personalities, because frankly, if they did otherwise, we would be just be wasting council taxpayers' money, because the case would just not stack up. This is predicated on the libel manipulation and on mis-selling, and the particulars of the claim are essentially just about that. It's not about personalities. Okay.
Look, there is a massive piece about the mis-selling of this, and myself and others in the room, and of course Councillor Fiaz, Whitworth and Gray were campaigning for this for approximately 3 years. So I agree that is these things absolutely were missold. They didn't understand them, who signed off on them, the conflicts of interest with the Treasury advisors. There is so much that can be talked about. It's been well documented by Joel in the report. The beauty and the simplicity of the current legal action that's being pursued by Newham and others is almost all of that is not relevant when you're talking about bank fraud. In very simple terms, you entered into a contract. Had you known the bank was manipulating the very essence of that contract, you simply wouldn't have gone into it. So all of that is still valid, and absolutely it's true, and we're arguing it in lots of other cases all the time, but we don't need to go into those contested, murky waters, even though we are right to do so.
In response to what you were saying about campaigning, I think we have to be on the streets. That's where we've really succeeded in meeting people and raising the issues, and the importance of a housing campaign being an anti-racist campaign is absolutely vital. We often meet people who are misled by, the arguments that are out there that there's no housing because there's immigrants, there's no jobs because there's immigrants, and it's absolute racist narrative that we have to challenge, and we've been doing that since 2013. We'll continue to do it. That there's no housing, it's nothing to do with immigration. It's an economic and a situation that we're in, capitalism in crisis, etc., etc. It's absolutely vital that we make sure that every housing campaign is an anti-racist housing campaign.
I tend to look at the roots of the problem and the systemic issues, and there very much is an issue with systemic racism in as Hannah said, within the austerity narrative. So it needs to be tackled at a national level, and there's two people who haven't yet got credit for all their incredible work on this, and that's Fanny here and Vika, and they are an amazing source of knowledge on what absolutely needs to be done next from a national campaigning point of view.
I'm amazed there's not been a mass movement. I think there have been movements against austerity that have been really important, but I'm amazed there's not been a mass movement which focuses on the financial system. And look, I mean, that is a difficult thing to achieve. I think the trade unions have failed absolutely in terms of challenging the power of the banks since 2008. It's not just the trade union. We can't rely on the trade union. There needs to be a movement that unites people in target. And one of the things that we could talk about is writing off debt. You know, and that's something where there have been movements in Spain and in other countries, a movement to write off debt. You know, and we know that if we got into that movement, we'd also expose the racism of it, because we know that more vulnerable people and also are given debt at more punitive rates. We know that some communities are targeted more. Black communities tend to be targeted more, for example, in terms of mortgage debt or, you know, mortgage deals. So I think a mass movement which focuses on the financial system needs to come out of the crisis at the moment.
On the conflict of interest point for the Treasury advisors, look, generally speaking, the Treasury advisors today are a lot more careful. There are more stricter FCA guidance rules on them. Look, you can't say this is not going to happen again, but they are generally more careful now about disclosing commissions, relationships, etc., etc. But of course, that's no guarantee until this happens again in the future.
If I may, can I just also add, just in terms of the other part of the question that you asked, which is what is the new administration doing to mitigate against this stuff happening, notwithstanding the comments that Abhishek has made in terms of the regimes become much more tighter. In the context of Newham, we presently have we had under the previous administration the audit board, which in every single other local authority is called the audit committee and signs off on accounts, being chaired by the cabinet member for finance. That doesn't happen. It's an independent member. And we are going to be evolving the audit board so it becomes in line with the normal, an audit committee, and it will be approving the accounts as well. With regards to the external accountants that do the accountant firms that do the external audit, unfortunately, as with every single other local authority, we're tied to a particular procurement framework which is set, and we've got to choose from one of the big four. And so at the moment we've had to jump from PwC previously, which were the accountants that did our external audit, when both John Gray over there and I first jumped onto the LOBOs in Newham issue, to Ernst & Young. But it's about ensuring that, one, we enhance the financial literacy of all of our councillors. Previously that just did not happen. That we're also enhancing the financial literacy of our residents. So we've put in place a new model of citizen and resident engagement through citizen assemblies. I've pledged that I would like to evolve Newham to become a blueprint in participatory democracy. That will also include residents involved in our budget setting processes, and it's about ensuring that there's the requisite checks and balances. So a couple of weeks ago, I made the most significant announcement to the directly elected mayoral model in Newham, where I changed the scheme of delegation, which basically means, whereas before every single decision, literally every single decision, was made by one person, the mayor, and under the previous administration, that executive decision power making held in one person was retained over the period of the directly elected mayor system since 2002. I changed it, so now it's decision making by virtue of majority at cabinet, and it's only in extreme circumstances where I would step in if it's kind of, a massive humanitarian crisis, and I would need to step in. So it's about beginning, as part of the pressing the reset button and going back to normal, all of the putting in place all the requisite checks and balances. I'm having a conversation with our our monitoring officer is basically our head of legal, around disclosure and making sure that more of our information is out in the public domain, and for us to be less less risk averse, and then obviously initiating a culture change within the organisation so that officers, i.e. the people that work at the council, don't feel scared to just be open and honest and transparent. And and it's difficult. It's difficult for them because being the other way has become so normal, and dealing with a new administration which is pretty pragmatic and relaxed about openness is really difficult and challenging for them.
Paul, just to pick up your point about the sort of rationale for the loans, conflicts of interest. I mean, just to point out, yeah. So the companies that were advising the local authorities on these loans, companies like Capita, Butlers, which is part of a brokerage company, ICAP. I mean, they were clearly making thousands of pounds in commission each time the council took out one of these loans. There was a clear conflict of interest by the people who were advising the local authorities into these deals. The people that signed off typically were either the Section 151 finance officer or the chief accountant. And I think the point to make further to what we've heard from the councillors this evening is that actually, in most cases, none of the councillors ever saw one of these contracts while they went through local authorities. They were done in closed door settings by council officers without view of local authority councillors. So I think it's wrong to blame the councillors for what happened, because they were basically excluded from the whole process. And just further to the kind of rationale of how and why these things were taken out, I think it's well worth looking into what was going on around the housing revenue account reforms in the mid-2000s. So Newham's auditor at the time, PwC, was actually advising government on those reforms. And so that resulted in a loss of debt with the government institutions, the Public Works Loan Board being written off, and some refinancing going on via these private banks, who Barclays was one of which PwC has happened to audit at the time. So there's clearly a government kind of statecraft objective going on here, encouraging borrowing from banks, getting debt off the government balance sheet that's been driving this. And just to kind of echo Rachel's comments about the amount of work that's gone into this report from Fanny and Vika and other members of our organisation like Jamie, who couldn't be here, over many, many years to get this report out. So thank you for all your hard work.
Yeah.
I mean, you borrow £100 and the next day you owe £150. And that is the problem with these structured loans. You can have loans where that doesn't happen, and you need to do three things. One is they need to be short term. Two, you have floating interest rates. And three, you don't have these dodgy options in them. Now, let's say short term. Crossrail is probably the biggest project in London for the last 50 years. And that's only taken 12 years. So why are you borrowing money at 70 years? It's potty. And you've lost. You borrowed 35 million and you now owe 75. You've been paying off the interest, and that's because it was fixed rate. It's gone from 35 to 75. There's a 10 million loan here that's gone up to 31. That's 3 times. If you borrowed at floating rates, that would be exactly the same amount as it was when you borrowed it. Does that make sense? No. Okay, I rest my case.
Thank you for everybody who has spoken tonight, and especially to our amazing lineup of speakers. And I'm really sorry to all of you who had your hand up. Luckily, it wasn't that many people who had your hands up and didn't get to speak. But we do have this space until 10 o'clock. Obviously, it is quite late, 9:30 on a weekday evening, so I totally acknowledge if people have to run off. But if you do have the time to just keep drinking juice and tea and snacks and mingle and chat, we can keep doing that. And yeah, I'm really, really glad that we've had such a good discussion about debt and the way that debt disciplines councils into these undemocratic actions. And then we've also had Roxana talking about how to overcome that and start moving Newham a little bit closer towards democracy. And this is a really, really good place to end this, hopefully, first chapter in this fight against LOBO loans that we hope to see replicated in a lot of other councils. So thanks so much to everybody for being here tonight.